What happens when the person we trust the most hides a secret so dark it could destroy everything? This question isn't just a plot twist in a mystery novel. It's a real-life scenario that has unfolded in the small town of Thornbrook. A story of betrayal, manipulation, and the abuse of power that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust and authority. At the heart of this story is Sheriff Eric Bradwell, a figure who seemed like the model of reliability and integrity. He had the respect of the town, the trust of his colleagues, and the unwavering support of the community. But what if that image wasn't as solid as it seemed? What if the person everyone relied on for protection and justice had something to hide? And then there's Judy Edson, a local resident who found herself caught in a web of deception, manipulation, and a series of choices that would alter the course of her life. The events that unfolded between these two would eventually rock the town to its core. But what led to this devastating chain of events? Was it a matter of power gone wrong? Or was it something more personal? A deeply hidden secret that slowly unraveled everything Sheriff Bradwell and Judy had worked so hard to protect? In today's video, we'll dive deep into the disturbing truth behind this story, exploring how betrayal can take root in even the most trusted relationships, and how it can turn a seemingly calm life into one filled with regret and loss. You won't want to miss the twists and turns that will challenge your perception of loyalty and justice. Before we jump into the full story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Your support means the world to us, and we're grateful for our amazing community of viewers. For all of our loyal subscribers who've been with us through every episode, thank you. Your continued engagement and feedback keep us motivated to bring you the most captivating stories. Stay tuned, because what's coming next is nothing short of eye-opening. The small town of Thornbrook, nestled in the rolling hills of rural America, was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name, and the pace of life was slow and steady. The streets were lined with modest houses, the kind of place where families settled and stayed for generations. Its charm lay in the simplicity of everyday life. The corner store that served as both a convenience stop and a social hub, the local diner where everyone gathered for coffee in the morning, and the town square that hosted the occasional festival or community event. The sense of familiarity and comfort was woven into the fabric of the town, and its residents took pride in the safety and security they felt, knowing that everyone was looking out for each other. In the center of Thornbrook's safety net stood Sheriff Eric Bradwell, a man whose reputation had become as deeply ingrained in the town as the oak trees lining Main Street. Bradwell had been the town sheriff for over a decade. During his time in office, he had built a reputation not just as a lawman, but as a role model. His commitment to justice, integrity, and public service had earned him the respect of the town's residents, both young and old. Whether it was responding to an emergency call in the dead of night, attending local school events to support the youth, or offering guidance to young officers just starting out in their careers, Bradwell was there. Beyond his work in law enforcement, Bradwell was a family man. He had a wife, 2 children, and a home that reflected the stability he had worked so hard to provide. He was known to be approachable, even when his authority was firm. People trusted him, and in a town like Thornbrook, trust was everything. To most, Eric Bradwell was the embodiment of everything good about their community. Loyal, dependable, and always putting others before himself. But Bradwell's influence went beyond his role as sheriff. He had taken on a mentorship role for many of the young men and women in Thornbrook, especially those interested in law enforcement. Among them was Judy Edson, a 17-year-old high school senior with big dreams of following in her father's footsteps. Judy had lost her father, a local police officer, when she was just a child. He had died in the line of duty, a tragedy that left a deep void in her life. She remembered him as a brave and caring man, someone who did what he could to keep people safe, just like the way Sheriff Bradwell did. Growing up without a father had been hard on Judy. Her mother worked long hours to make ends meet, and though Judy had a strong bond with her, it wasn't the same as having a father figure. For years, she had watched Bradwell from a distance, admiring his dedication to his job and the way he interacted with the community. He seemed to have the perfect balance between authority and compassion. She felt a strong connection to him, not just because of his position, but because, in many ways, he reminded her of her own father. Judy had made up her mind early on that she wanted to be a police officer, to serve her town the way her father had, and there was no one she admired more than Sheriff Eric Bradwell. To her, he was the model of what she wanted to become: strong, steadfast, and respected by everyone around him. So, when the opportunity arose for her to become an intern at the sheriff's office, she jumped at the chance. For Judy, this was more than just a job shadowing experience. It was a chance to learn from the person she looked up to the most, to get an inside look at the world she hoped to one day be a part of. Her relationship with Bradwell grew in those months of working together. He became a mentor to her, offering advice on how to navigate the complexities of law enforcement, how to handle tough situations, and how to balance the weight of responsibility that came with the badge. His guidance was more than just professional. It felt personal too. Judy couldn't help but notice that Bradwell's conversations often had an almost fatherly tone. He offered her not only career advice but also wisdom on life, relationships, and handling the challenges that came with losing someone you loved. Bradwell saw a lot of himself in Judy. He could tell she had the drive and determination to succeed in the field, despite her youth. There was a quiet strength about her, a resilience that came from her painful past. He took it upon himself to help guide her, to show her what it truly meant to serve and protect. There was something about her that reminded him of his own early days on the force, and he wanted to ensure that she didn't make the same mistakes he had made when he was starting out. For Judy, the time spent with Bradwell was invaluable. She began to see him not just as the sheriff, but as a protector, someone who took a special interest in her success. She admired how he handled tough situations with grace and integrity, never wavering in his commitment to the job or to the town. He offered her advice on the importance of upholding the law, even when it was difficult, and how to maintain a sense of compassion when dealing with others. It was clear to Judy that Sheriff Bradwell wasn't just a man of the law. He was someone who genuinely cared about the people of Thornbrook, just as she hoped to one day care for others as a police officer. However, as much as Bradwell's mentorship meant to Judy, there were sides to him that she didn't fully understand. He was a man of few words, especially when it came to his personal life. Bradwell was respected, but he was also somewhat distant. He had a tendency to keep his private life under wraps, something Judy had come to accept as part of his persona. Still, in the few personal moments they shared, he revealed hints of the struggles he faced, balancing the demands of his job, his family, and the expectations placed upon him. Despite his seemingly perfect exterior, Bradwell was far from immune to the pressures of life. Thornbrook was a town that prided itself on unity, where everyone played their part and worked together to maintain the peace. In many ways, Sheriff Eric Bradwell had become the cornerstone of that unity. And for Judy Edson, he was more than just a mentor. He was someone she deeply admired, trusted, and looked up to. Little did she know that the very person who seemed to have all the answers would soon become part of a complicated and dangerous story, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about trust, loyalty, and the people who shape our lives. As Judy Edson began her internship at the Thornbrook Sheriff's Department, it was clear to her that she had entered a world far different from the halls of her high school. Here, in the heart of the sheriff's office, where everything had a sense of purpose and authority, she was determined to prove herself. Sheriff Eric Bradwell was more than just the town's lawman. He was the embodiment of everything she aspired to be: professional, capable, and respected. As someone who had lost her father in the line of duty, Judy found herself drawn to Bradwell's steady presence, seeing in him not just a mentor, but a kind of surrogate father figure. On her first day, Sheriff Bradwell welcomed her into his office with a smile that made her feel like she belonged. His easygoing demeanor put her at ease immediately, and they fell into a comfortable rhythm as she began her duties. At first, it was basic work: answering phones, filing paperwork, and sitting in on briefings. Nothing too glamorous, but it was enough to show her how the department operated. Slowly, Bradwell began to invite her to accompany him on more field work. He let her shadow him as he handled traffic stops, questioned witnesses, and worked through various cases. Bradwell seemed to have an innate way of handling difficult situations. He spoke with authority but without aggression, and there was a calm confidence to his every decision. It was evident that his years of experience had shaped him into someone people respected without question. But it wasn't just his professionalism that made him stand out to Judy. It was the way he spoke to her, the subtle guidance he offered, and the personal stories he shared. Bradwell had a knack for making people feel seen and heard, and Judy was no exception. One afternoon, after a long day spent running errands for the department, Bradwell invited her to his office to sit down and talk. Judy had grown accustomed to his subtle mentorship, but this moment felt different. There was something in the air, a quiet, unspoken bond between them. As they sat across from each other, Bradwell started to open up about his own journey in law enforcement. "You know, Judy," he said, leaning back in his chair with a slight smile, "when I started out, I was just like you, eager, determined, but also a little uncertain. I was hungry for knowledge, but I didn't have anyone guiding me." He paused for a moment, as though reflecting on those early days. "My mentor back then was a tough old guy. He didn't pull any punches. Told me that being a cop wasn't about showing people what you knew. It was about understanding people and knowing when to act." Judy hung on every word. She had heard similar advice before, but coming from Bradwell, it carried a weight that made her take it to heart. She admired how he had learned through experience and now passed on that wisdom. "You remind me a lot of myself," Bradwell added, looking her in the eye. "I see the same drive in you, Judy. You've got the potential to make a real difference here." His voice softened, almost fatherly in tone. "You just need to trust yourself." For Judy, these moments felt like small victories. She was slowly being molded into someone who could contribute meaningfully to law enforcement. Bradwell's praise made her feel like she was on the right track, even though the road ahead seemed long and full of uncertainty. It also filled a gap left by the absence of her own father. There was something comforting about Bradwell's presence, like the reassuring feeling that someone, for once, had her back. As the weeks passed, their professional relationship deepened. Bradwell didn't just teach her the basics of law enforcement. He shared his personal stories with her, moments from his career that had shaped him into the man he was. Some stories were humorous, others were harrowing, but each one offered Judy a glimpse into his world. She learned how he had navigated difficult cases, how he had faced failure and triumph in equal measure, and how he balanced the weight of his responsibilities with his personal life. In one conversation, Bradwell spoke of a particularly challenging case from years ago. A young officer had made a mistake during a high-stakes investigation, causing the department to lose valuable evidence. The officer had been devastated, thinking he'd ruined his entire career. Bradwell had been the one to pull him aside and offer a rare piece of advice. "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is how you move forward." It was moments like these that drew Judy even closer to Bradwell. She felt he was preparing her for what was ahead, teaching her not just how to be a good officer, but how to be resilient when things didn't go as planned. Her admiration for him grew with each passing day, but so did her vulnerability. Judy had never truly gotten over the loss of her father. The wound had never fully healed, and there were times when it felt as though no one truly understood what she had been through, except for Bradwell. In a way, he was the closest thing to a father she had left. But despite her growing admiration for him, there were moments when Judy began to notice small things, subtle inconsistencies in Bradwell's behavior. At times, he would get lost in thought, his gaze drifting out the window as if he were somewhere far away. It was as though there was a part of him that remained distant, even when he was offering guidance or engaging in casual conversation. Occasionally, there would be times when he seemed a bit too keen to spend time with her, especially when it came to working late on cases or having private meetings. One evening, after finishing a particularly long shift, Bradwell asked if Judy could stay late to help with some paperwork. He had been distant during the day, but now, his tone was unusually insistent. "Judy, I know it's late," he said, his voice softer than usual, "but I really need your help with this. It's an important case, and I trust you." His words made her feel both valued and a little uncomfortable. She had never known Bradwell to be anything but professional, but tonight there was an edge to his behavior that she hadn't noticed before. She agreed, of course. It was part of the job, and it meant Bradwell had confidence in her abilities. But as the night wore on, the unease grew. Bradwell seemed more intent on keeping her there than necessary, even as the minutes stretched into hours. The way he looked at her, his gaze lingering a bit too long, his questions directed at her in ways that made her feel both seen and scrutinized, started to make her uneasy. As the clock ticked past midnight, Judy couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Bradwell had always been a mentor to her, but tonight there was a subtle shift in their dynamic. It wasn't that he had crossed any lines. It was more that his behavior, small as it was, had planted a seed of doubt. He was still the sheriff she looked up to, but there was now a quiet tension between them, something she couldn't quite place. In the days that followed, those subtle moments continued to linger in her mind. They didn't overtly change her opinion of Bradwell, but they made her more cautious. Judy was no longer simply taking everything at face value. There was a part of her that began to question if the trust she had placed in him was entirely well-founded. For now, she pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the tasks at hand. But deep down, she couldn't help but wonder if she was beginning to see another side of the man who had once seemed so perfect. If Bradwell's guidance was truly as pure as it appeared, or if there was something lurking beneath the surface, something that she couldn't yet fully understand. Little did she know, the mentorship that had started with the best of intentions was about to take a turn. One that would challenge everything she thought she knew about Bradwell, herself, and the path she had chosen. And when that shift came, it would shake Thornbrook to its very core. As the weeks passed, the once professional relationship between Sheriff Eric Bradwell and Judy Edson began to evolve. What started as a straightforward mentorship, built on respect and a shared passion for law enforcement, slowly started to take on a different tone. Bradwell had always been a steady presence in Judy's life, offering her a sense of stability and guidance that she hadn't found elsewhere. He had been there for her when the weight of her father's death seemed unbearable, and his words of wisdom became the foundation on which Judy built her dreams of following in his footsteps. But now, there was something different in the way he interacted with her. Subtle, at first, and then undeniable. It began with the late-night meetings, the discussions that went past regular office hours. Bradwell would call her in for important cases that somehow always seemed to require her personal attention. Sometimes it would be a small task, like going over evidence or reviewing reports. Other times, it would be Bradwell asking her personal questions about her future, about her family, her goals, and her fears. In these moments, he began to position himself not just as her mentor, but as her confidant. "You know, Judy," he would say, his voice lowering as though sharing a secret. "Sometimes, people outside of law enforcement just don't get it. They don't understand what we go through, the kind of pressure we face. I've been through it myself, and I know you have too." He spoke to her as though they were two of a kind, two people who shared the same unspoken bond. Over time, these moments grew more frequent and more personal. Bradwell started to isolate her from her peers and family. He would suggest that she distance herself from friends who didn't understand the demands of her work, positioning himself as her sole source of support. Judy began to feel like she was slipping away from the life she once knew, drawn closer to Bradwell's world of quiet authority and solitude. One day, after a particularly grueling shift, Bradwell offered to drive her home. Normally, Judy would have declined, but today, something in his voice convinced her otherwise. As they drove through the quiet streets of Thornbrook, Bradwell casually asked, "How's your mom doing?" "I haven't seen her in a while." Judy hesitated. It was a question she didn't quite know how to answer. Her mother, still grieving her father's death, had withdrawn into herself in ways that left Judy to shoulder more than her fair share of emotional weight. "She's okay," Judy said, her eyes looking out the window, feeling the quiet tension settle in. "I think she's still just figuring things out. It's been tough, you know?" She glanced over at Bradwell, trying to gauge his reaction. "I know exactly how you feel," Bradwell replied, his voice soft but intense. "Losing a loved one is something that never really goes away, especially when they were such a big part of who you are. But you know, you've got me. You're not alone in this. I can help you, Judy." Judy felt a small but unmistakable twinge of discomfort. She had never questioned Bradwell's intentions before, but now, His words seemed to be heavier than they had been in the past. She looked at him. His eyes were on the road, but his tone felt more intimate than she was used to. It was as though he was reaching into parts of her that she wasn't ready to let anyone touch. But Bradwell was persuasive. His calm demeanor and the unspoken promise of safety, of stability, were like a balm to her wounded heart. Judy struggled with these growing feelings of unease, torn between the comfort Bradwell offered and the nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. She had always admired him. No, more than admired him. She had looked up to him as a figure of strength and integrity, someone who had taken her under his wing and made her feel valued. But as his behavior shifted, so too did her internal compass. Each time he asked her to stay later, each time he praised her in private for her dedication, it became harder to see the line between their professional relationship and something more personal. Was she reading too much into things? Or had Bradwell truly crossed a boundary? There were moments when she was still able to push away the doubts, when she told herself that he was just being protective, just offering support in ways no one else had. But in the quiet corners of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than she was willing to admit. Her instincts told her to be cautious, but her longing for stability, for someone who seemed to understand her, pushed her to ignore those instincts. One evening, after a particularly draining day, Bradwell caught her off guard. He was standing in his office, looking out the window at the fading light, and when he turned to face her, his expression was unreadable. "I've been thinking about you, Judy," he said, his voice unusually soft. "You've got a lot of potential. I see so much of myself in you." He took a step closer, and Judy felt her heart race. The air between them seemed to thicken, a tension growing that hadn't been there before. "You deserve someone who will protect you, someone who will always have your back." His words, so carefully chosen, began to chip away at her hesitation. In those moments, Bradwell wasn't just her mentor. He wasn't just the sheriff. He was someone who understood her better than anyone ever had. Someone who cared. The pressure from her father's death, the expectations from her mother, the loneliness that had been with her for so long. All of it seemed to melt away in the comfort of Bradwell's gaze. For a moment, she felt the slightest flicker of excitement, a sense that maybe this was what she had been missing. Maybe Bradwell was the stability she had been searching for, the father figure she had never had. Maybe he was the one who could make her feel like she truly mattered. But in the pit of her stomach, there was still a gnawing feeling, a hesitation she couldn't quite name. Despite her lingering reservations, Judy found herself drawn to Bradwell in ways that confused her. His presence, once comforting, now felt charged with something more, something deeper. It wasn't just his compliments or the time they spent together, but the way he made her feel special, important, like she was the only person who mattered in that moment. One night, after they had finished discussing a recent case late into the evening, Bradwell invited her to dinner. She hesitated, knowing it was late and she should probably go home, but the pull of his invitation was strong. "You've been working so hard, Judy. It'd be good for you to take a break. Let me treat you to something nice." They ended up at a small diner on the outskirts of town. Over dinner, their conversation turned more personal, more intimate. They talked about their pasts, about the loss that had shaped them, about the dreams they had yet to fulfill. As the night wore on, it was easy to forget that there were lines that should never be crossed. Bradwell's attention was so intense, so focused on her, that Judy felt both flattered and uncomfortable at once. Later, as they stood outside the diner, Bradwell stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. His touch sent a shiver down her spine. "You've been through so much, Judy," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "You deserve to be happy. You deserve to be loved." It was the way he said it, softly, with so much sincerity, that made her heart race. She looked up at him, unsure of what to say. The air between them crackled with an unspoken tension, and in that moment, it felt as though time stood still. Bradwell leaned in, his lips brushing her ear as he whispered, "I care about you, Judy, more than anyone else. I can help you, protect you, but you have to trust me." For a heartbeat, Judy hesitated, her mind racing. This was where it crossed the line. This was where the mentorship became something more. But she was so desperate for connection, for someone to show her the care and understanding she had longed for. And so, she trusted him. Her guard lowered, and in a single, fragile moment, they crossed the line. Their first kiss was slow, tentative, but full of the weight of unspoken desire. It was the start of something that neither of them had anticipated, yet both had been drawn into. For Bradwell, it was the culmination of a plan that had been taking shape over months. For Judy, it was the unraveling of everything she thought she knew about herself and the world she had once trusted. As their relationship shifted into something darker, the lines blurred between right and wrong, between mentor and lover, between protection and manipulation. And from that moment on, everything changed. As the weeks passed, a mix of exhilaration and dread clouded her thoughts. She was navigating a complicated relationship with someone she had trusted completely, someone who had offered her a future and guidance. But everything began to shift in ways she couldn't have predicted. Her budding affection for Sheriff Bradwell had turned into something much more complicated, an affair she could hardly comprehend. It started with a delayed period. At first, Judy dismissed it. Stress, she thought. The sleepless nights, the constant whirlwind of emotions. But when the morning sickness came, subtle at first, but undeniable, Judy couldn't push it aside any longer. She took the test in the small bathroom of her house, hands shaking as she saw the two pink lines appear. She was pregnant. Her heart sank. She sat on the cold bathroom floor, her mind racing. She wasn't ready for this. Not like this. Not with him. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone and dialed his number. Sheriff Bradwell had been her mentor, her protector, and now he was the source of her deepest dilemma. The moment he picked up, his voice was calm, reassuring, as always. "Judy, everything okay?" Her heart hammered in her chest. "I need to talk to you. It's urgent." He responded quickly, setting up a meeting for that evening. Judy felt a strange mix of relief and dread wash over her. She couldn't handle this alone anymore. She needed someone to help her make sense of it all. And she thought, maybe, just maybe, Bradwell would be the one to offer clarity. That evening, they met at a small, quiet cafe just outside town. Bradwell greeted her with his usual smile, his eyes warm with concern. Judy couldn't meet his gaze as she slid into the booth across from him. "You've been distant lately." She took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm pregnant." Bradwell's expression didn't change. He leaned back slightly, his calm demeanor making her feel both reassured and uneasy at the same time. "I see," he said after a moment, his tone a bit colder than before. He seemed to be thinking, weighing his options. "Judy, you know we can handle this. We can make it go away." Judy's stomach churned. She'd expected a response, but not this. "Make it go away," she repeated, her voice breaking. "What do you mean?" "Look, it's simple," he said, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "We can go to a clinic, take care of it. You won't have to deal with the consequences. We can keep this between us. You don't have to tell anyone." Judy stared at him in shock, her mind struggling to comprehend his words. This was Bradwell, her mentor, the man who had always seemed to care for her. But now, something felt off. Something was wrong. "I can't," Judy said, her voice barely audible as tears welled in her eyes. "I can't do that. This is my child. I don't want to hide anymore. I don't want to erase it." Bradwell's expression shifted, his eyes darkening. He leaned in closer, his tone more insistent now. "Judy, you don't understand. Think about this. You're a young woman with your whole life ahead of you. A baby will ruin everything. You don't want to be known as that girl, do you? The one who made a mistake." Her heart clenched. She felt as if she were suffocating under his gaze. But despite the weight of his words, something inside her stirred. She wasn't ready to give up. This was her chance to create a life of her own, to finally have something real. "I don't care," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm keeping the baby." For a long moment, Bradwell didn't respond. His expression was unreadable, his jaw clenched. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold, calculated. If that's your decision, fine. But you need to understand that this will change everything. If anyone finds out, you won't just ruin your life, you'll ruin mine too. Judy felt a shiver run down her spine. His words had a weight to them that she couldn't ignore. But she clung to her resolve. This was her choice, her body, her future. But as the days passed, Bradwell's demeanor began to shift. The charming, reassuring man she had once known began to reveal a different side. One that was cold, controlling, and driven by an intense need for self-preservation. At first, it was subtle. Small gestures. The way he'd call her more frequently, checking in with her, but in a way that was more demanding than protective. His messages were laced with guilt, pushing her to reconsider her decision. He reminded her constantly about the consequences of her pregnancy, the rumors, the scandal. "You're not just hurting yourself," he'd say. "You're putting both of us at risk." Judy began to feel trapped. She was still so young, and her dreams of becoming a police officer were suddenly overshadowed by this secret she could no longer keep hidden. She knew what Bradwell was capable of, and the way he spoke to her made her uneasy, like he was slowly isolating her from the world she had known. But as much as she tried to distance herself from him, he kept coming back. His phone calls, his visits, they became more frequent, his presence more suffocating. "Judy," he said one night, as he walked with her, after a long, uncomfortable conversation, "you need to think carefully. This could ruin both of our careers. You're smart. You know what this could do." Judy stood still for a moment, staring at the ground, her thoughts spinning. Was he right? Was she really being selfish? But then she thought of her father, his legacy, his sacrifice. Her decision to keep the baby wasn't just about her. It was about carrying on something meaningful, something that couldn't be taken away. But Bradwell was relentless, and his manipulation had started to take hold of her. His words no longer seemed like advice. They felt like threats wrapped in concern. "I've been there for you," he'd remind her, his tone softer, almost fatherly. "I've always been there. I can help you. We can get through this together." Judy began to question herself. What if he was right? Could she really do this alone? Could she face the consequences of her decision, knowing how badly it would hurt everyone? But even as the doubt crept in, something inside her resisted. She didn't want to fall into his control again. She didn't want to be the person he tried to shape her into. But it was getting harder to fight him off. One evening, as Bradwell visited her again at her home, the tension between them finally reached its breaking point. They sat across from each other in her small living room, the silence heavy between them. Bradwell's eyes bored into hers as he tried one last time to convince her. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice smooth, persuasive. "Maybe it's time we start planning. You can come work for me, keep things quiet. We'll figure this out. No one has to know. We'll protect each other." Judy felt her heart race. He was trying to corner her again, to make her feel like she had no choice. And that's when it hit her. Bradwell wasn't just trying to protect his career. He was trying to control hers. He saw her pregnancy as a threat, something that could unravel everything he'd worked for. She realized that all along, it wasn't about her well-being. He was only concerned with his own reputation. A chill ran through her as the full weight of his manipulations settled in. Her mentor, the man she had trusted, was now nothing more than a man desperate to protect himself at all costs. His carefully constructed image, his public persona, it was all fragile. And she was the one who could break it. For the first time, Judy understood the depth of the situation. The stakes were higher than she had imagined. Bradwell's threats were no longer veiled in the guise of care or concern. They were real, dangerous, and growing more desperate by the day. And she had no idea how far he would go to protect his secrets. Her decision to keep the baby had set everything into motion, but now it was clear. Bradwell would stop at nothing to silence her. The battle for her future had just begun, but little did she know, the darkest moments were still ahead. It was a chilly fall afternoon, the kind where the air is crisp and sharp enough to make your breath visible in the cold light. The sky above the small town was an empty, muted gray, and the woods just outside the edge of town were eerily quiet, save for the soft rustling of the dry leaves. The fading sun cast long, crooked shadows across the path as Sheriff Eric Bradwell drove Judy Edson out to a secluded spot, far from prying eyes. He told her it was a chance to talk, really talk, about her future. It was his idea, of course, and he had carefully selected this remote location. A quiet, peaceful place away from the town's watchful gaze. Judy, ever the trusting young woman, believed him. She had no reason not to. After all, Bradwell had been a mentor to her, and she had always believed that the sheriff only had her best interests at heart. As they drove further into the woods, the roads grew narrower, and the familiar sights of the town faded into the distance. The trees lined the road like silent sentinels, their dark branches stretching overhead as though trapping them in an ancient, forgotten world. It was the kind of place where no one would hear you scream. Judy felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She didn't know why, but something about the place made her uneasy. Her mind raced as she thought about all the things she had learned in her life. The fact that nothing in the world is ever truly free, and that sometimes a person's kindness has a cost. But she shook off the feeling, telling herself that it was just her nerves. She had no reason to be suspicious of Bradwell. He had always been the father figure she had longed for after losing her own father years ago. The truck's tires crunched on the gravel as they slowed to a stop. Bradwell turned off the engine, and for a moment, all was still. The only sound was the soft flutter of leaves in the wind. "Come on," Bradwell said with a grin that was almost too warm. "Let's take a walk." Judy hesitated for a split second, still feeling the discomfort creeping up her spine. But she swallowed her unease and followed him out of the truck. She had never questioned him before, and it was hard to think that anything could go wrong. Bradwell led her down a narrow trail, surrounded by tall, dense trees that blocked out much of the light. The air grew colder as they ventured deeper into the woods. She couldn't help but notice that the farther they walked, the more isolated they seemed. The town was miles away, and there was no one around to hear a scream, let alone offer help. The trail wound around a bend, leading to a clearing. A small, abandoned cabin sat at the edge, a broken-down, rotting structure that looked as though it had been forgotten by time. Bradwell stopped and turned to her. His eyes were calm, almost too calm, as though he was holding something back. "Judy," he said, his voice unusually low, "I've been thinking about your future. We've talked about law enforcement, and I really think you're on the right path. But you're also still young. You have your whole life ahead of you." Judy nodded, not sure where this conversation was heading. She looked around the clearing, trying to find something to focus on other than the tightening in her chest. Bradwell took a step closer, his eyes darkening just slightly. "But I need you to understand something. There's more at stake now. More than just your future. There are consequences to the choices you make. Big ones." Judy frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Bradwell's eyes flickered to the ground, as if contemplating his words carefully. When he looked back at her, the warmth had left his gaze, replaced by something colder, more calculating. "You can't tell anyone about what's happened between us, Judy. Not now. Not ever." She froze. What's happening? Her mind raced, but the words were stuck in her throat. The last few months had been filled with complicated emotions, emotions she had refused to acknowledge until now. But here they were, surfacing, raw and unfiltered. She felt her pulse quicken, and her thoughts scattered. "What are you talking about?" Judy stammered, stepping back slightly. Bradwell's jaw clenched. He took another step closer, his voice lowering even more. "It's too late for us to go back. We can't pretend anymore. Not when this," he gestured vaguely between them, his words trailing off. "Not when this could ruin everything." A sick feeling spread through Judy's stomach, but she couldn't make sense of what he was saying. What did he mean? Bradwell reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, silver object, something cold and sharp. Judy's heart skipped a beat as she realized what it was. A knife. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The air around them felt suffocating, thick with tension, and the world seemed to narrow into that single, horrifying realization. She stared at the knife, her breath quickening. "Bradwell, what are you?" Before she could finish the sentence, he lunged. It was quick, too quick. Bradwell grabbed her arm, yanking her close, and in the same fluid motion, pressed the cold steel against her throat. Judy gasped, her hands instinctively flying to her neck. But Bradwell was too strong. His grip on her arm was unyielding. His eyes were focused, determined, his face a mask of cold calculation. "Please," Judy whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "Please stop." But Bradwell didn't listen. The look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't about her. It was about him, about his fear, about his desperation to keep everything buried, to protect his reputation, his life. Judy's eyes searched for something, anything, to help her escape. But there was no one. No one in the woods, no one who could hear her. She was completely alone. The world tilted as Bradwell pushed the knife deeper. The last thing she felt before everything went dark was his grip loosening, his hand pulling away from her neck as she crumpled to the ground. Bradwell stood over her body, breathing heavily. His pulse thudded in his ears, but the weight of the act hadn't hit him yet. The knife was still in his hand, and he looked at it for a long moment. He needed to get rid of it, get rid of everything. With a quick, practiced motion, he wiped the blade clean, then buried it deep in the dirt, hoping it would never be found. He looked down at Judy's lifeless body and let out a slow breath. "I'm sorry, Judy," he murmured under his breath. "I'm sorry, but this is the only way." For a moment, Bradwell stood there, frozen. He couldn't help but feel a sick thrill run through him, the rush of power, the fear fading away. He had done what he needed to do to protect himself. As he turned to leave, he glanced back at Judy one last time. Her body lay still, her dreams shattered in the blink of an eye. Bradwell's heart didn't race anymore. It was calm. Even as he walked back to the truck, every step felt deliberate, controlled. By the time he returned to town, it was as if nothing had happened. He slid back into his role as sheriff, the same confident, composed figure everyone knew him to be. But inside, a storm was brewing. There was no going back now. Bradwell had crossed a line, and he was willing to do anything to make sure no one ever found out. He would protect himself at all costs, even if it meant pretending to mourn Judy's disappearance, the girl who had once trusted him with her dreams. The town would never suspect him. No one ever did. It was 2 days after Judy Edson disappeared. The small town of Thornbrook woke up to a feeling of heavy uncertainty. What had been a peaceful, idyllic community was now clouded by an unsettling mystery. The local news stations buzzed with reports of the missing 17-year-old, and the townspeople, once comfortable in their quiet lives, found themselves drawn into a drama that would forever alter the fabric of their community. Thornbrook had never seen anything like this before. Judy was not just a resident. She was a fixture, the daughter of a fallen officer. With dreams of following in her father's footsteps, she had been a beacon of hope for the next generation. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through the entire town. The rumors began circulating almost immediately. Some speculated that she'd run away, feeling overwhelmed by the pressures of her life. Others suggested something darker, something more sinister, especially considering her close relationship with Sheriff Bradwell. But no one dared to voice those suspicions out loud. After all, Bradwell was the one person everyone in town trusted. Sheriff Eric Bradwell, who had always been a pillar of the community, now found himself at the center of a swirling storm of concern, confusion, and disbelief. Judy's disappearance was sudden, unexplained, and felt all the more jarring because she had been a known and loved figure around town. Her father, a former officer who had been killed in the line of duty, had left a legacy of service and sacrifice that Judy carried with pride. To see her vanish without a trace seemed impossible. But in a town like Thornbrook, impossibilities had a way of becoming reality, especially when the person at the center of the mystery was someone everyone trusted. Bradwell, still playing the role of concerned sheriff, sprang into action. He organized search parties, took calls from worried families, and reassured the public that he was doing everything in his power to bring Judy home. His voice, normally so steady and commanding, now wavered with an air of desperation that was almost convincing. His grief, palpable on every news broadcast, made him seem like the tragic, protective figure who could do no wrong. And no one questioned it, not at first. As the days wore on and the search for Judy continued, the residents of Thornbrook rallied together in ways they hadn't in years. Flyers bearing Judy's smiling face were tacked to telephone poles and windows, while search teams combed the dense woods outside town. Vigilance became a community effort. Everyone had a role to play, everyone had a stake in bringing the girl home. But deep down, a few people began to wonder. They couldn't put their finger on it, but something about Bradwell's behavior seemed off. It wasn't long before the case was handed over to Detective Amanda Williams. Amanda was an outsider, having recently moved to Thornbrook after spending years working in the city. Her sharp instincts, analytical mind, and experience with high-stakes investigations quickly earned her respect among her new colleagues. With a no-nonsense attitude and a keen eye for detail, she wasn't someone who was easily swayed by appearances. The small-town politics, the camaraderie, the friendships, it all meant nothing to her when it came to solving a case. From the moment she arrived, Amanda could feel the weight of the town's collective grief hanging in the air. There was no denying the tragedy of a young woman's disappearance, but Amanda's instincts told her that there was more to this case than met the eye. She was quick to notice how tightly knit everyone was, how they all seemed to view Sheriff Bradwell as an infallible figure, as though the thought that someone so trusted could be involved in something sinister was beyond their comprehension. Bradwell's status as sheriff only compounded the mystery. He had been in law enforcement for over 2 decades, had a spotless reputation, and was beloved by the community. It was hard to imagine him as the type of person who could be involved in something so horrific. But the more Amanda observed, the more questions arose. As she gathered her team and reviewed the evidence, Amanda found herself drawn to the inconsistencies in the timeline Bradwell had provided. His version of events, at least on the surface, didn't add up. Amanda's first major red flag came when she started analyzing the details of Bradwell's account of Judy's last known movements. According to Bradwell, he and Judy had been in constant communication in the days leading up to her disappearance. They'd supposedly met several times to discuss the future, her career, his role as her mentor, and the challenges she faced in her personal life. But when Amanda dug deeper, she began to uncover discrepancies. For one, the timeline of Bradwell's interactions with Judy seemed off. He claimed they had met on the evening she disappeared, but local surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store showed Bradwell entering the store alone, hours before he said he'd seen her. There was no record of their meeting in the places Bradwell had mentioned. The more Amanda reviewed, the more she felt something was being hidden. Judy's phone records revealed no contact from her after that evening, and a check of Bradwell's own phone records showed a string of calls placed to her from his private cell phone, none of which he had mentioned. There was an oddness to these calls. Bradwell had claimed they were brief, just casual check-ins, but the records suggested longer conversations. What had they talked about? Why had he not disclosed these calls when first questioned? Amanda's skepticism deepened when she considered Bradwell's emotional response to the situation. Everyone else in the town seemed distraught, but Bradwell's grief was tempered. His reactions were just controlled enough to seem genuine, but there was a layer of calculation to them, something Amanda couldn't quite place but couldn't ignore. When Bradwell spoke about Judy, it was as if he were reading from a script, talking about her bright future, how she was like a daughter to him, how he had mentored her, how deeply upset he was. But the delivery lacked a personal touch. He wasn't broken like the parents of a missing child would be. Instead, he appeared more like a man trying to maintain a facade of the grieving sheriff. As the investigation wore on, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Detective Williams started connecting dots that no one else had even considered. There were reports of arguments between Bradwell and Judy in the days leading up to her disappearance, silent, tense moments that didn't make sense in the context of their close, mentor-mentee relationship. Judy had been visibly shaken at times, and though she had confided in a few friends about her troubled feelings, she had kept quiet about the details of her relationship with Bradwell. It was as if she had known something she wasn't ready to say. But why hadn't she said anything? Amanda couldn't help but wonder if she had been intimidated, if Bradwell had made her feel like she had nowhere else to turn. The sheriff was a man of power and authority, someone who could easily control the situation. Amanda also learned that Bradwell had been particularly protective of Judy in recent months, always around when she needed help, offering her emotional support and personal advice. But in a way, that seemed odd. Why was he so focused on her, so protective? And why had their relationship become so secretive? Amanda continued her investigation, all the while growing more and more convinced that Bradwell knew more than he was letting on. The final piece of the puzzle came when she received a tip-off from an anonymous source. The information pointed to a secluded spot just outside of town, a remote area of woods that Bradwell had frequently taken Judy to talk. It was the same place where he'd once claimed to have met her before her disappearance. She gathered her team, and they quietly set out to re-examine the area. There, in the woods, she discovered something chilling. A small, unmarked grave, partially dug but clearly disturbed. The site had been carefully hidden, but Amanda's instincts told her that it was more than just a coincidence. It was a clue, a piece of the story Bradwell had been hiding. The more Amanda learned, the clearer it became. Bradwell was not the hero he appeared to be. And yet, he was still playing the role. The grieving sheriff who wanted answers, who wanted justice for the girl who had been taken from him. His web of lies was so well spun that, even now, no one had fully connected the dots. But Amanda Williams was on the case. And she wasn't about to let this investigation be another casualty of small-town loyalty. The chase for the truth had only just begun. It was a crisp morning when Sheriff Eric Bradwell's world, a world built on authority and trust, shattered in front of the very people he once served. The news had come quickly. Detective Amanda Williams had connected the dots, and now it was time to confront the man who had once been a pillar of the community. As Bradwell sat in his office, staring at the desk in front of him, the doors swung open. Detective Amanda walked in with an air of determination, her face betraying no emotion. Behind her stood two officers, their hands resting on the handles of their cuffs. The moment Bradwell lifted his head, the weight of the situation seemed to crush him. He knew. He had known this moment was coming, even if he had tried to deny it. His mind raced with thoughts of escape, of how he could still protect himself. But there was no way out now. "Sheriff Bradwell," Amanda said coolly, her voice unwavering, "you're under arrest for the murder of Judy Edson." Bradwell froze, his face pale, the blood draining from his features as the reality of the words sank in. The man who had spent years upholding justice, the one who had guided so many with wisdom and authority, was now the one in handcuffs. The room was silent for a moment. A slight tremor ran through Bradwell's hand as he reached for his desk, bracing himself. The officers closed in, but before they could make a move, Bradwell's voice broke the stillness. "You can't. This is a mistake," he stammered, his usual composure evaporating. "I didn't do it. I swear, I didn't." "Save it for the interrogation," Amanda interrupted, her voice firm. "We've got enough evidence to put you away for good." As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the sound echoed in Bradwell's mind like a death knell. The weight of the arrest, of everything he had worked for slipping away, crushed him like a vice. Outside the sheriff's office, word spread quickly. People gathered in small clusters outside the station, shocked whispers rising in the air. "It can't be true," one elderly woman muttered, her hand clasped over her mouth. "I don't believe it," another neighbor whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "I've known Bradwell for years," said an older man, his voice filled with regret. "He's been like family. This isn't him." The small town, where everyone knew everyone else's business, couldn't fathom the truth that had been lurking under the surface. This was the same man who had protected their families, who had been a mentor, a father figure. Now, their trust had been shattered. How could it be real? Could they have been so wrong about him? As Bradwell was escorted out, his face was devoid of emotion, but his mind was anything but calm. He had led the investigation himself, had pretended to mourn Judy's disappearance, had cried in front of the townspeople, all while hiding the darkest secret anyone could imagine. The whispers followed him, the weight of the town's judgment pressing down like 1,000 tons of stone. Later, as Bradwell sat in the interrogation room, his mind raced. Detective Amanda hadn't spoken much to him. She hadn't needed to. She had already pieced together the truth. The forensic evidence, the inconsistencies in his story, the timeline of events, they all pointed straight to him. It was only a matter of time before he would crack. Bradwell sat in the cold, stark room, his back stiff against the metal chair. His mind spun. He had always prided himself on being in control, but now the control had slipped from his hands. He felt cornered, exposed. He had no choice but to face the inevitable. Amanda walked in, her gaze steady, unwavering. She closed the door behind her and took a seat across from him. She said nothing at first, giving Bradwell a moment to stew in his thoughts. The silence grew heavy. "Sheriff Bradwell," she said finally, her voice calm but laced with authority, "we have everything we need. The evidence, the testimonies, the inconsistencies in your story. It's over." Bradwell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew the jig was up, but his pride wouldn't let him go down without a fight. He tried to put on a mask of confidence, though it faltered as he spoke. "Look, detective, I didn't mean for it to happen. You have to understand." His voice quivered slightly, betraying his earlier bravado. Amanda leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "You didn't mean for it to happen? You didn't mean to kill her?" Bradwell looked away, his jaw tightening. There was no escaping the truth now. It had all been set in motion by his own hands. His manipulation, his lies, his betrayal. It had all led to this. She was a mistake," Bradwell muttered, his words filled with self-loathing. "I never should have let it go this far. She was just a kid, you know? I should have never taken her in. I should have stopped the moment I saw her as a daughter." His words faltered, as though trying to explain away the horror of his actions. "Then why did you kill her, Eric?" Amanda asked, her tone icy. "Why did you take her life?" Bradwell's face hardened as the confession spilled out, as though the dam holding it all in had broken. "She was going to ruin everything," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "She was pregnant, detective. I couldn't let her ruin my career, my reputation. I didn't think I had a choice. She kept saying she was going to keep the baby, and I couldn't have that. I was already losing control." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes wide as he stared at the ceiling, as though trying to escape his own thoughts. "She wasn't supposed to be in the woods that day. I thought I could talk to her, convince her to end the pregnancy. But she didn't listen. She refused. And I just snapped. I don't know what came over me. I didn't mean to hurt her. I couldn't lose everything." His voice cracked as he spoke, but there was no real remorse in it. It was as though he were telling the story of someone else, trying to justify the unspeakable act he had committed. "I never meant for it to go that far," he continued, his tone filled with weak justification. "But you have to understand, she was my responsibility. She wasn't supposed to go and ruin everything." He paused, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him, but his eyes were cold, detached. "I did what I had to do." Amanda was silent for a moment, processing the words. She had heard confessions before, but this one was different. Bradwell wasn't even trying to show remorse. There was no genuine guilt, only self-preservation. He had crossed the line, and now he was scrambling for any excuse to absolve himself. "You took her life because you were afraid of losing your own," Amanda said, her voice low but steady. "You're right about one thing, Sheriff. You did what you had to do, but not for her. You did it for yourself." Bradwell's eyes flicked to hers, and for the first time, something resembling shame flashed across his face, but it was fleeting. There was no redemption here, no apology, only a man caught in his own web of lies, trying to justify a crime that could never be undone. As the confession ended, Bradwell slumped forward, the weight of his own actions finally sinking in. But even then, his thoughts remained fixated on one thing: his reputation. The lie he had lived for so long was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. And so, Sheriff Eric Bradwell, once the trusted leader of the town, was now just another criminal to be processed. But even as they prepared to escort him to his holding cell, the damage had already been done. The trust he had spent years building was shattered beyond repair. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was a scene of tense silence. What had started as a small-town tragedy had now ballooned into a spectacle that captivated the entire community. The town, which had once regarded Bradwell as a pillar of strength and honor, was now forced to reconcile with the shocking reality that the man they trusted had committed an unspeakable act of violence. At the center of the room, Bradwell sat hunched over, his eyes avoiding the gaze of those who had known him for years. His once pristine uniform now felt like a mockery of the position he had held. He was no longer the man in control now. He was the accused. The trial began with the prosecution making their case. District Attorney Linda Morgan stood tall and confident as she addressed the court. Her voice was firm but compassionate as she recounted the sequence of events that led to Judy Edson's death. She described how Bradwell had manipulated a vulnerable teenager, gained her trust, and ultimately betrayed her in the most horrific way possible. Her words cut deep, not just for Bradwell, but for the entire community. "We were all blind," Morgan said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We trusted him. We believed in him. And he destroyed that trust in the most brutal of ways. He took the life of a young woman who had her whole future ahead of her, a girl who looked up to him as a mentor, as a father figure. And when she threatened to expose his secret, he chose to silence her." The room fell silent as the emotional weight of Morgan's words settled over the crowd. The Edson family, seated in the front row, barely held it together. Judy's mother sat in the courtroom, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She had already suffered the loss of Judy's father, a fallen police officer, and now the family is forced to face this unspeakable betrayal. The prosecution's case was bolstered by the testimony of Detective Amanda Williams, who had meticulously pieced together the events leading up to Judy's death. She spoke of the evidence that linked Bradwell to the crime. The phone records showing Bradwell's calls to Judy just before her disappearance, the blood-stained soil found near the woods where her body was discovered, and the confession Bradwell had given to her. Cold, calculating, and devoid of remorse. As Amanda spoke, Bradwell's eyes flickered toward her. There was a momentary flash of something. Guilt, perhaps, but it quickly disappeared. He had been caught, but he wasn't ready to accept the reality of what that meant. His lawyer, a defense attorney known for his sharp legal mind, attempted to discredit the prosecution's case, poking holes in the investigation and suggesting that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. But there was no denying the evidence. The case was airtight. Judy's mother stood up to give her victim impact statement. Her voice was raw, cracked with grief, as she addressed the court. "My daughter, my Judy, was taken from me by someone we trusted, someone who was supposed to protect her. We gave him our faith, and he used it to destroy us. We will never get our daughter back. She will never see the dreams she had, never wear the uniform she wanted to wear. And we will carry that pain with us for the rest of our lives." As Judy's mother spoke, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The impact of her words echoed through the room. Bradwell's eyes were glued to the floor, his hands clenched into fists, though he remained silent. He couldn't look anyone in the eye. Not his former colleagues, not the grieving mother, not the community that had once trusted him. The defense attempted one final appeal: that Bradwell had acted in a moment of weakness, overcome by fear and panic. That he was overwhelmed by the pressures of his career, the scandal of the affair, and the threat of losing everything. But the prosecution was quick to counter. "Fear does not excuse murder," Morgan argued. Bradwell's actions were deliberate. He planned it. He drove her to the woods, and when she refused to end her pregnancy, he chose to end her life instead. There was no moment of panic. There was only calculation, and there was only one reason for it: to protect his own reputation. The trial continued for days, with the prosecution and defense making their final arguments. But there was no question in the minds of most who had followed the case. Bradwell had crossed the line, and no explanation could undo the damage he had done. It was late in the afternoon when the jury returned. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Bradwell sat motionless in his seat, his face devoid of any expression. He had already heard the worst of it in his confession. He knew the chances of him walking free were slim to none, But there was still a glimmer of hope, no matter how faint, that the verdict might somehow be in his favor. When the jury filed in, the silence was deafening. The foreman stood, clearing his throat as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, we the jury find the defendant, Sheriff Eric Bradwell, guilty of the murder of Judy Edson." The words struck like a lightning bolt, and for a moment, the room was frozen in disbelief. The gasps from the gallery were nearly drowned out by the pounding of Bradwell's heart in his chest. His mouth went dry as he processed the words. Guilty. It was a word he had hoped to avoid hearing, but it was now an undeniable reality. The judge gave a solemn nod, his voice steady as he asked for the sentencing recommendation. The defense attorney stood, asking for leniency, citing Bradwell's years of service and the tragic nature of the case. But it was clear that the weight of the crime, his abuse of trust, his manipulation of a vulnerable teenager, and the brutal way he had taken her life, could not be ignored. When the sentence was read, it hit harder than any blow. Sheriff Eric Bradwell, for the murder of Judy Edson, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The room erupted in a mixture of shock, anger, and sorrow. The Edson family collapsed into each other's arms, tears of both relief and continued grief staining their faces. They had gotten justice for Judy, but it would never bring her back. Bradwell remained seated, his face ashen, the reality of his fall from grace settling in. There would be no redemption, no second chance. His life as a free man was over. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, stripped of his title, his reputation, and any semblance of the man he once was. Although justice had been served, but the damage Bradwell had done to his community, his family, and the Edson family was irreversible. For the Edson's family, this was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one where they would have to learn to live with the knowledge that their daughter's life had been stolen by someone they had once trusted. For the community, it was a bitter lesson in the dangers of putting too much faith in one person, no matter how well-liked or respected they may seem. Bradwell's trial had brought the truth to light, but the consequences of his actions would linger long after the courtroom doors closed. The pain, the betrayal, and the heartbreak would never truly fade, and for many, the question would remain. How could someone so trusted, someone so revered, fall so far? As for Bradwell, the man who had once stood tall as a symbol of authority and respect, he was now reduced to a mere shadow of his former self. Behind bars, with no possibility of redemption, he would have nothing but time to reflect on the choices he had made. The choices that had ultimately led to the loss of everything he had once held dear. In the weeks and months following Sheriff Eric Bradwell's conviction, the once peaceful town found itself in a deep and unrelenting shock. The community, which had trusted Bradwell for years, was now grappling with the fallout of a betrayal that no one could have foreseen. The sense of security they once felt, knowing that their town was protected by a leader they admired, was shattered. The reality that the very person they relied on for safety had been capable of such betrayal left everyone feeling vulnerable and uncertain. How could they have been so blind? How could they have missed the warning signs that now seemed so glaring in hindsight? There were whispers on the streets and at the local diner, a shared sense of disbelief permeating the air. The town's law enforcement, once a symbol of unity, became divided. Some officers still couldn't accept the truth, holding on to the image of their former mentor, while others felt a profound sense of shame for not seeing the darker side of Bradwell's character sooner. The Edson family, too, found themselves at the heart of the town's collective grief, their pain becoming a symbol of the community's broken trust. Efforts to rebuild the town's trust in its justice system were immediate but challenging. The local council began talks about implementing stricter oversight and more transparent procedures within the sheriff's department. New officers were brought in, but no one could erase the haunting shadow left by Bradwell's actions. Public forums were held, and support groups for those affected by the case sprang up, offering the residents a space to process their grief and confusion. But for many, no amount of counseling could ever fully heal the wounds left behind. The sheriff's office itself was under the microscope. There were multiple investigations into past cases Bradwell had overseen, with many questioning if justice had truly been served in all of them. The town was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how power had been abused and how easily trust could be manipulated. Judy Edson, a bright young woman with dreams of following in her father's footsteps as a law enforcement officer, was gone, but not forgotten. Her legacy, though tragic, became a symbol of resilience and the importance of standing up against abuse of power. In the wake of her death, the community rallied around her memory, determined that her story would not be buried with her. The local high school established a scholarship fund in her name, aimed at helping young women pursue careers in law enforcement. Judy's family worked tirelessly to advocate for better mentorship programs and policies within the law enforcement community, determined that no other young person would be manipulated or harmed in the way Judy had been. Judy's dream of becoming a police officer was cut short, but her life sparked a wider conversation about the vulnerability of young people, especially those who, like Judy, had lost someone close to them and were searching for guidance. Schools across the region implemented new programs aimed at teaching students about boundaries, power dynamics, and the importance of seeking help when faced with manipulation or abuse. Judy's legacy wasn't just a tragic story. It became a catalyst for change, a reminder that we must always be vigilant, even in the people we trust most. She was remembered as a young woman who had dreamed of making a difference, a dream that, in many ways, had come true. She had inspired an entire community to confront the uncomfortable truths about their own institutions and to work toward a better future. As for Sheriff Bradwell, the reality of his fall from grace was one that no amount of reflection could make easier. Behind the cold, gray walls of prison, he was nothing more than another inmate, forgotten by those who once revered him. The name Sheriff Bradwell no longer carried weight. It was merely a reminder of the man who had been trusted and adored by so many, only to betray them in the most unforgivable way. In the early days of his incarceration, Bradwell clung to the idea that his actions, though regrettable, were somehow justified. He told himself that he had been protecting his career, his reputation, and his life. But as the years wore on, he began to realize that he had lost far more than he had ever hoped to gain. His family and friends had turned their backs, and the very community that had once seen him as a hero now regarded him as a symbol of everything that could go wrong when power was abused. He spent his days in solitary confinement, reflecting on the choices that had led him to this point. But in the silence of his cell, there were no comforting words, no one to listen to his excuses. He was left alone with the knowledge that he had betrayed not only the trust of a young woman who had looked up to him, but the very community that had given him everything. As we reflect on the tragic story of Sheriff Eric Bradwell and Judy Edson, we are left with uncomfortable questions. The tale of betrayal, manipulation, and the abuse of power is one that forces us to confront our own assumptions about the people we trust most. How well do we really know them? How often do we place our faith in individuals simply because of their titles or reputations, only to find out that the very people we believe are protecting us are the ones capable of hurting us the most? Bradwell's story is a sobering reminder that power can be easily corrupted. It shows us how one person's desire to maintain control and preserve their own image can have catastrophic consequences for those around them. We want to believe that the people we trust are always acting in our best interests, but this story serves as a stark reminder that betrayal can come from the most unexpected places, even from those who are meant to protect us. At the same time, Judy's story is one of tragedy, yes, but also of courage. She was vulnerable, searching for a father figure, for guidance in a world that had already dealt her a harsh blow. And yet, despite everything, she found the strength to stand her ground. Her story may have ended too soon, but her legacy continues to inspire those who are drawn to law enforcement and those who are determined to ensure that such abuses of power are never repeated. The moral complexity of this story lingers long after the trial and sentencing. It forces us to ask ourselves, how much do we really know about the people we trust? Are we too quick to place our faith in someone based on a reputation or title without truly questioning their motives? What does it take for a person to become capable of such betrayal? And what does it take for us to recognize the warning signs before it's too late? As we close this chapter, we thank you for joining us in reflecting on this haunting and tragic story. If you feel moved by Judy's legacy or the lessons Bradwell's fall from grace has taught us, We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced betrayal at the hands of someone you trusted? How did you move past it? If you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and share this video. We truly appreciate your support in spreading awareness about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of looking beyond the surface of those we place our trust in. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.